So I'm happy to have Harsha Walia here. Harsha Walia is a migrant justice activist and organizer, the author of Undoing Border Imperialism, and most recently, this wonderful book, Border and Rule. So Harsha's got some real perspective on the global situation with borders and displacement. So thanks for joining me, Harsha.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. So we've got our big question right off the top, which is, how does immigration detention damage the societies in which it's allowed to occur?
Ooh, small question. Yeah, I think immigration detention really is such a crucial pillar of border violence at large, right? And if we think about borders and we think about the ways in which they enact violence, they're really based on creating categories of us and them. It's, a central way to organize societies into who belongs, who doesn't, who we consider as part of us, who we consider part of them, how we maintain all kinds of oppression, right? Racial citizenship, which is then underwritten, of course, by, gender, class, ability, sexuality, and more. And detention is a key part in that because we literally arrest and contain people in order to expel them, to literally remove them from our communities and from our society, right? And detention, alongside prisons and jails, is that kind of structural immobilization and control of people that we think don't belong, that we think should be cast away, that we think are undeserving. And all of which really is about all of these hierarchies in our society. And so I think it damages us because it feeds into this idea of who gets to live where and under what conditions, and the dehumanization that we allow when we even, to justify detention, we have to buy into, at some degree, this idea that human beings can be illegal, right? And so movements that affirm that no human being is illegal or nobody is illegal are inherently anti-detention and anti-deportation because we refuse the idea that there are categories of people that are illegal, illegalized, criminalized, undeserving. And so I think it harms us because we internalize this idea that certain people belong and others don't. And more importantly, it also maintains global apartheid about who belongs where, who has a right to live where. And, the global north and the global south are not places on a map, right? The north doesn't exist in the north part of the world. The global north and global south are social, political, economic constructions that maintain power in our world. And detention maintains that form of apartheid between the so-called global north and the so-called global south, where some of us get to live with a life of luxury, relative safety, relative comfort. Our life expectancy is determined in large part by where we are born. It's not certainly the only thing, but it is a large part of that. And detention maintains that fundamental inequality about who has a right to life and under what conditions.
Thanks. Yeah, you mentioned removal, and they're literally called, the detention centers in the UK are literally called immigration removal centers, just this sort of blatantly, at least they're not playing around and trying to fake us out what's going on there. But
in Quebec, in Canada, for a long time, the one in Quebec was called the Immigration Prevention Center.
And prevention, yeah, I know, unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people, this is how it's sold to the public. Borders make us safe. Why don't borders make people safer?
Because borders, like prisons, like police, right? These are institutions that are sold to us that they make us safe. But really, they just enforce violence. And I think we have to ask ourselves a number of questions. What are we afraid of? Who are we afraid of? What is inherently unsafe about people coming to live alongside? And when we tap into what that fear is, those fears are not of individual people, because we certainly don't take the time to know their story, right? So it's not actually about this person will make me unsafe because of a particular behavior or action. We assume people will make us unsafe because of structural oppression, right? And especially of the fear of a Black planet, the fear of a brown planet, the fear of racialization kind of quote unquote tainting our values and our cultures. And so that fear is racist. It's fundamentally racist. And so when we really start to question where do those fears emerge from, what kinds of fears are they stoking, it comes down to that, and even the kind of seemingly less overtly racist kind of fears, the ones about, migrants and refugees, we fear that they'll take over our resources. They'll take over our jobs, those kinds of fears that are based in scarcity, which may not seem as much about racism, but more about scarcity, then we have to remember that our real enemy arrives in a limousine, not on a boat, right? Like that's the logic of austerity. It's not that immigrants are taking away jobs or taking away public resources. It's because the logic of capitalist austerity has made us to believe that there is not enough for everybody. And so they don't make us safe. And really they, again, reinforce divisions. They reinforce divisions between humanity, between, the international working class, like, shutting borders are not, preventing migrants and refugees is not going to lift up the wage floor for the working class, right? Borders are actually a spatial fix for capitalism. They actually lower the wage floor. So ultimately, borders enact, of course, immense violence on those who are migrants and refugees or those who are undocumented. And they don't make, those who are citizens, if you will, any safer. It really just breeds xenophobia and hostility and division.
Perfect. Thanks so much. That was really ideal what you're just saying there, because another thing I would love to have brought up, and I don't think we need to necessarily now, but just you write about in Border and Rule, you write about the politics of fear as this distraction. The immigration invasion and, it's kind of stupid stuff. We need to secure our sovereign borders, which is such a distraction from the actual policies that are actually damaging people, which we don't even get around to, that's the whole distraction thing is unbelievable and so frustrating.
Yeah. And I think, the part that I find particularly insidious as well about this kind of invocation of the migration crisis and the specter of fear around it is, both the politics of distraction and also the deep colonial erasure around it all, right? The idea that the migration crisis, especially since 2015 in Europe, for example, the invocation of it as new, the invocation of it as a crisis that, presents the Western nation state or Europe as its victim, erases centuries of structural violence, right? It erases capitalism. It erases imperialism that has deliberately caused the impoverishment and underdevelopment of the so-called global South. And it's also offensive because it completely erases the global violences of, settler colonists moving freely, if you will, for centuries into the Americas and Oceania, while 12 million Africans were enslaved and while, millions of Asians were indentured around the planet, right? So also the invocation of this as like a new crisis ignores the kind of continuities of violence and really also the conditions of possibility, right? Like the condition of possibility for Europe and the UK is this long legacy of empire and capitalism. And so now kind of invoke border militarization. And again, that specter of fear of being overrun by migrants and refugees is so deeply offensive because it also ignores the ways in which we're bound up in these violences, right? It's not about generosity or benevolence or charity. It's about reparations in many ways.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Harsha.